where I have, over the last 20 years of my work in particular, where I've seen people practice the most powerful, expansive, inclusive, interdependent, beautiful forms of family and community are people who have been marginalized in some way. So it's Black folks, queer people, poor people, unhoused people, folks with disabilities, sex workers. So that's who I talked to. That's who I interviewed for my book. And part of my assumption, which is really not what the book is about, but was clear to me, is that my son just got home and is outside making noise now. Is that there are two reasons that those groups of people do family in a way that I think is like, the model for all of us. And that is partly because the culture we live in that really places the insular, heteronormative, white nuclear family up as an ideal has excluded those people from participating in that model of family and the kind of success idea that comes along with it. And it's also because when you are kept out of systems of wellness, right, when our systems don't work for you, you figure something else out. And I think that has kept a lot of folks, and this is not to say that like everybody who's marginalized like does family great or does community great or knows all these things, but that's where I've seen the most beautiful models that really exemplify what it was that I was looking for. So that's why I talk to. So the book is just like full of stories of those folks. And I just want to say, like, talk about I learned so much. And the process of researching the book, which was like, talking to people and being in relationship with folks. These were like a lot of the folks who I talked to are people who are in my community in some way. Like making this book really transformed how I show up in the world and what my relationships look like. And there are three things I feel like that feel like particularly resonant right now. So the first thing is that making family and community outside of the kind of independent, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, insular nuclear family model requires vigilance. Our cultural norms, the benefits that exist, all of the designs really point us toward American dreamism. And the normativeness and the kind of, rightness of the nuclear family just like litters our pop culture, right? Non-nuclear families are framed as failures or mistakes or tragedies, even if the portrayals of them are compassionate. There are more than 1,000 federal benefits for people who are legally married. Aside from this, one policy at the Aspen Institute, like most workplaces decide who qualifies as your family if you're employed there. And they use that qualification to determine who can access benefits or who you are allowed to take time to grieve for. If you look at the design of cars or like the aptly named single family home, right? They assume that the people who are going to be using those things or occupying those things are two adults and some small people. So in order to live your life outside of that norm, because there is so much kind of just like pushing us toward that, both in terms of how we are all socialized, but then also in terms of how our world is designed, you have to really be vigilant. And I think this has shown up for me in that, I am a cisgendered woman married to a cisgendered man, and we have biological children. We, own our own home. We have a dog. And I find that we have to be really intentional about not kind of like letting our household really be our world. We've had to work hard to make sure that we are really including our chosen family in helping us raise our children. We've had to make sure that we're really including our neighbors and other community members in just like being in our lives and like being in our home and us being present with each other. So that's one of the things that I feel like I learned. A second thing is that queering our lives is liberating. And by queer, I mean, I'm going to quote this poet who I quote in the book, this guy, Brandon Wint. I think he's from Toronto. He wrote this thing on social media several years ago, and it's been put on t-shirts and posters and made memes of. And what he said was, not queer like gay, queer like escaping definition, queer like some sort of fluidity and limitlessness all at once, queer like a freedom too strange to be conquered, queer like the fearlessness to imagine what love can look like and to pursue it. And so many of the conversations I had with people, and so many of the things, what I witnessed in terms of how people's relationships, they created their relationships by queering them, was really about like not accepting cultural definitions of what partnership is, what romantic and sexual partnership is, not accepting definitions of what family is, not accepting definitions of what friendship is. And that's everything from, you know, having chosen family to having, you know, thruples raising children, thruples being like three people raising children. One of the folks I interviewed in the book talked about how they weren't close to their biological family, but there was a woman, I'm not going to get this all right. And I also have to be careful of not, like, I know what I made a lot of people's names. I changed a lot of people's names in the book because family is very fraught for a lot of folks. So I have to also, I don't remember what I changed this person's name to. But they, you know, they had this really close figure in their life who was friends with their parents growing up. And when that person died, that person's ex-girlfriend showed up at the funeral, and the person who I'm writing about, they became family with this like ex-girlfriend of a family, like a chosen aunt. And I just loved kind of the weird geometry that people like had to follow in order to make family for themselves. There's another couple in the book who are two straight women, and they are they're each other's plus one for everything. They have planned their retirement together. They you know, they're each other's emergency contacts. They both date and, you know, have relationships with, like, romantic sexual relationships with other people, but they are each other's like primary partners. And I love their friendship. And it's really allowed me to specifically think about my friendships as things that are not about, that don't kind of exist inside of the parameters that were given to me about what friendship is, but to really allow each of my friendships to have its own culture, which means I'm in conversation with the people who are closest to me about what our expectations are of each other, what it is we want from each other. And there's just this really beautiful kind of exploration that I've been able to go through with a lot of the people who are really close to me, so that we actually get to define our friendship for itself and allow it to be the thing that it's meant to be for us, as opposed to assuming that because it fits in the category of friend, it means like X, Y, and Z, and it doesn't mean these other things. So that's been really powerful. And I think when it comes to my marriage, I mean, I've never had a marriage where, you know, I assumed that my husband was going to be kind of like all of the things for me, right? Where we were like two halves coming together to make a whole. But I think that I was like, we've been able to be more explicit about what it is we provide for each other and where it is we find, you know, other things that we need from other people. And that's made, I think, has given, it's created a little bit of lightness in our relationship, because we're not trying to get things from the other person that person can't provide. And it's not about saying like, well, I don't need these things, right? It is about being like, okay, if I need this in my life from another human being, like, who else can I get it from? And then being explicit in those relationships about where we can get those things. And I love that kind of the way in which my marriage has really dialed in terms of what we get from it and what we get from other people. The third thing that was like a consistent thread throughout the entire book and throughout everything that I kind of talk to people about was that like Americans are like allergic to asking for help. Everything that we're told about what it means to be successful, what it means to be a leader, what it means to be strong, frames asking for help as weakness. We think of asking for help as a thing you only do like if you're desperate, right? Like that you really need it and nothing else will work, and that there's some kind of shame involved in that. And part of what I saw from the like healthy models is that like we really need to get better at asking for and offering support. And I think right now, right, while we're experiencing these multiple crises, we're in a global pandemic, and we just experienced another cycle of white violence. And there's also the like escalating fascism of our government, and our institutions and systems of care and support are either alarmingly unprepared to help us, or they just don't exist at all. So we're left with each other. But because we have been, socialized poorly, right? The way we've been socialized has really poorly prepared us for interdependence. We have a really hard time actually asking for the support, not just that we need, but the support that we want. And I think that, my experience is that sheltering in place has like shaken loose some of that socialization, but I feel like we really need to dig deeper into our interdependence by both reaching for the parts of us that can think abundantly and be generous, and really connecting with the intuition that tells us who we need to check in with and what we can offer by way of support. But then we also really need to get better at asking for and accepting support, not just when we're desperate or we need it, but just because it would lighten our load. One of the things that I feel like was particularly useful that I learned from folks who I interviewed for the book was how to offer help that is specific and focuses on creating ease, right? Because when you say something like, let me know if I can help you, or do you need anything, to somebody who's struggling, then they have to do this additional labor of like figuring out like, what is it that they need? And like, they're also doing this calculus of trying to figure out like what they think you're capable of providing. Cause they don't want to ask for something and then you're like, oh, I can't do that. Cause that feels really shitty. So like, folks taught me to say things like, if I brought you dinner tomorrow, would that be helpful? Or I know you're doing a lot of caretaking right now. Could I spend an hour on Zoom with your kid so you can go take a bath? And it's easier for folks to say yes to something specific and not have to think up something than it is for them to, not have to think up something, right? And I was particularly struck too by this idea that support can be about something that brings ease to our lives as opposed to something that meets like some desperate need, right? So, like I had a friend last week text me and say, can I get you dinner? She's like, I can order it for you, I can Venmo you money, or I can make you dinner. And, I need dinner. Like I could make another box of mac and cheese for my kids. Like that would have been fine. But I said yes, because I was feeling stretched thin by all of the space holding that I'm doing for Black folks, for the last couple of weeks. And having dinner, right, having her make dinner for us would just like bring some ease to my life. And that is why she offered. And part of what is so powerful about that, like giving support and accepting support, is that it is part of this cycle that we can get into. It's not about, giving support to somebody because then they'll owe you, or you're like earning points with your gods. It really is because it brings you like a sense of, it feels restorative to me, right? It feels like I am part of this beautiful cycle. And partly that thing is that it strengthens our relationships because it builds intimacy. Being able to like provide somebody with something that they would find useful, or being vulnerable enough to let somebody do that for me, allows for us to know each other more deeply. And that kind of intimacy feels really, really necessary right now. And in part because I feel like, you know, I'm a little apocalyptic in my thinking. So I worry about, you know, what the election is going to be like, what the like next wave of COVID is going to be like. Like there's lots of potential disasters that I see coming. And I feel like in the times when we really do need other people, right? And I suspect there are going to be more of us in that position in the next, you know, coming month and coming years. When we've built that kind of intimacy with each other, when we've built that like muscle of being able to say yes when somebody offers us something, or building the muscle of like inserting us into each other's business in a way that I think we also avoid because we don't want to be up in each other's business, and we feel like we're not supposed to do that because people like to be independent. I feel like the way that we build that intimacy makes it easier to actually ask for things when we really do need them. And that to me feels like, well, both something I want to be prepared for, but also like ultimately all of us have moments in our lives when we actually do need help and support. And if we've built a community of folks with whom we can without shame ask for those things, then we just like, it just lightens our load. I think that's all I have to say right now.